Black cumin, also known as Nigella sativa, or simply black seed, is not actually related to cumin. It's a member of the buttercup rather than carrot family. Black cumin is used in Indian and Middle Eastern cuisines just like any other regular spice, and has a peppery flavor, but it's also been prized for purported medicinal benefits. Described as a miracle herb, with mentions going back to the Old Testament, it was found cached in King Tut's tomb, for instance, and Prophet Muhammad is evidently quoted as saying black cumin could heal every disease except death. Only in the last 50 years or so has it been put to the test, though, culminating in more than 1,000 papers published in the medical literature. Typical doses used in studies are just 1 or 2 grams a day, which is only about a quarter teaspoon. This enables researchers to perform randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials by stuffing the whole food spice powdered into capsules, rather than studying some component or extract. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials have found that daily black cumin consumption significantly improves cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, and blood sugar control. Some of the results were quite extraordinary. For example, one study found that postmenopausal women randomized to a gram a day, which is less than a quarter teaspoon, of black cumin powder, reduced their LDL cholesterol by 27% within 2 months, significantly better than placebo. Those are the kind of results you'd expect from a statin drug, yet this was just a sprinkle's worth of a simple spice. Black cumin may even help with menopausal symptoms. Now, it didn't cure anything. A month after stopping the spice, cholesterol levels started to creep back up. But it does appear to be a cheap, safe, effective, and delicious, if you like things spicy, treatment for some of our deadliest risk factors. And the side effects? Loss of appetite and weight loss. Bingo! The latest systematic review and meta-analyses of randomized controlled weight loss trials found that about a quarter teaspoon of black cumin powder every day does appear to cause weight loss within a span of a few months. If it really can benefit so many facets of health, why don't you hear more about it? Why wasn't I taught about it in medical school? Maybe because there's little profit motive. Black cumin is just a common, natural spice. The daily dose used in most of these studies would cost about 3 cents a day. You're not going to thrill your stockholders by selling something you can't patent that costs 3 cents a day. Black cumin has become a staple in my family's daily diet. You can just keep a pepper mill filled with it right on the kitchen table, grind it onto foods just like black pepper, easy and delicious. Metastasis formation is the leading cause of death in cancer patients. That's how most people die of cancer. It's not the primary tumor, but the cancer spreading through the body. It's estimated that metastasis is responsible for 90% of cancer deaths, with little progress made in stopping the spread, despite our modern medical armamentarium. In fact, we can sometimes make it worse. Therapy-induced metastasis. All the typical cancer treatments, radiation, chemotherapy, surgery, even just poking the tumors with fine needle biopsies, have the potential to contribute to the problem. I mean, you can imagine how cutting around a tumor, severing the blood vessels, might lead to the migration of residual tumor cells. But why chemotherapy? How might chemo exacerbate metastases? Despite reducing the size of primary tumors, chemotherapy can change the surrounding tissues, resulting in an increased escape of cancer cells into the bloodstream. Sometimes chemosurgery, radiation are entirely justified, but sometimes these treatments can make things worse. If only we had a way to treat the cause of the cancer spreading. The development of anti-metastatic therapies has been hampered by the fact that we haven't been able to identify the cells that initiate metastasis, but then this landmark study was published. Researchers found a subpopulation of human cancer cells unique in their ability to initiate metastasis, all expressing high levels of a fat receptor known as CD36, dubbed the fat controller. It turns out palmitic acid, or a high-fat diet, specifically boosts the metastatic potential of these cancer cells. Where do you find palmitic acid? Although originally discovered in palm oil, it's most concentrated in meat and dairy. Emerging evidence shows that palmitic acid serves as a signaling molecule regulating the progression and development of many diseases at the molecular level, and that's the saturated fat that is recognized by the CD36 receptor on the cancer cells. And we know that's to blame, because if you block the CD36 receptor, you block the metastases. Now, this was for human cancer. However, it was a human cancer implanted into mice. But clinically, meaning in cancer patients, the presence of these CD36-studded metastasis-initiating cells does indeed correlate with a poor prognosis. For example, CD36 appears to drive the progression of brain tumors. If you look at the survival curves, those with tumors with less CD36 expression lived significantly longer. The same with breast cancer mortality. No surprise, since CD36 appears to play a critical role in the proliferation, migration, and growth of breast cancer cells. Inhibit CD36, and you can inhibit the migration and invasion of breast cancer cells. Cancer cell migration and invasion before and after CD36 inhibition. And not just in human melanoma and breast cancer-derived tumors. Now we suspect that CD36 drives ovarian cancer progression and metastasis too, since we can inhibit ovarian cancer cell invasion and migration, and block both lymph node and blood-borne metastases by blocking CD36. We see the same kind of effect with prostate cancer. Suppress the uptake of fat by prostate cancer cells, and you can suppress the tumor. This was all studied with receptor-blocking drugs and antibodies in a laboratory setting, though. If these metastasis-initiating cancer cells particularly rely on dietary fat to promote the spread of cancer, why not just block the dietary fat in the first place? Cancer cells love fat and cholesterol. The reason why fat metabolism may fuel cancer spread is because there's so much energy stored in fat. Hence, metastatic cells might take advantage of this feature to obtain the high amount of energy that is likely to be required for them to anchor and set up shop throughout the body. The time when sugar was considered as a major, if not only fuel, to support cancer cell proliferation is over. There appears to be a fatter way to metastasize. No wonder high-fat diets may play a crucial role in increasing the risk of different cancer types, including several advanced cancers. OK, if dietary fat may be greasing the wheels of the cancer machine, might there be specific dietary regimens we could use to starve cancers of dietary fat? You don't know until you put it to the test, which we'll cover next. Metastasis is the leading cause of cancer-related death. Cancer kills because cancer spreads. For example, the 5-year survival rate for women with localized breast cancer is nearly 99%, but that drops to just 27% in those with metastasized cancer. Yet our ability to effectively treat metastatic disease has not changed significantly in the past few decades. You know, things are getting desperate when there are papers like this, targeting metastasis with snake toxins. Now, we do have built-in defenses, natural killer cells that roam the body, killing off budding tumors. And I have videos on boosting natural killer cell activity, but as I explained in the last video, there's a fat receptor called CD36 that appears to be essential for cancer cells to spread. And these cancer cells respond to dietary fat intake, but not all fat. CD36 is upregulated by palmitic acid, as much as a 50-fold increase within 12 hours. Palmitic acid is a saturated fat found in junk food made from palm oil, but it's most concentrated in meat and dairy. This may explain why, if you look at dietary fat and breast cancer mortality, there was no difference in risk of breast cancer-specific death for women in the highest versus lowest category of total fat intake. But you're about 50% more likely to die of breast cancer if you eat a lot of saturated fat. The systematic review and meta-analysis conclude that saturated fat intake negatively impacts upon breast cancer survival. This may explain why intake of high-fat dairy, but not low-fat dairy, was related to a higher risk of mortality after a breast cancer diagnosis. If it was the dairy protein like casein that was a problem, the skim milk might be even worse. But no, it was the saturated butterfat. Maybe because it triggered the CD36-induced cancer-spreading mechanism? Women who consumed 1 or more servings per day of high-fat dairy had about a 50% higher risk of dying from breast cancer. We see the same thing with dairy intake in relation to prostate cancer survival. Drinking high-fat milk appeared to increase the risk of dying from prostate cancer by as much as 600% in patients with localized prostate cancer. But low-fat milk was not associated with such an increase in risk, so it seems to be the animal fat rather than the animal protein. And this is consistent with what Harvard researchers found in the United States. More evidence that the fat receptor CD36 is involved is that the risk of colorectal cancer from meat consumption increased from just doubling risk to octupling risk, multiplying the odds of getting cancer 8-fold for those who carry a specific type of CD36 gene. So, is it time to give breast cancer patients, for example, a prescription for a low-fat diet? A cancer diagnosis is a teachable moment, if there ever was one, to motivate people to make changes to their lifestyle. But provision of evidence-based guidelines is essential, and you don't know until you put it to the test. A randomized, prospective, multi-center clinical trial to test the effect of a dietary intervention designed to reduce fat intake in women with resected early-stage breast cancer, meaning the women had their breast cancer surgically removed and were praying it doesn't come back. The dietary intervention group dropped their fat intake from about 30% of calories down to 20% of calories, dropped saturated fat intake about 40%, and maintained that 40% lower intake after 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. And after approximately 5 years of follow-up, the women in the dietary intervention group had a 24% lower risk of relapse, a 24% lower risk of the cancer coming back. That was the WINS study, the Women's Intervention Nutrition Study. Then there was the Women's Health Initiative study, where again, women were randomized to drop their fat intake down to about 20% of calories. And again, those in the dietary intervention group experienced increased breast cancer survival, meaning a dietary change may be able to influence breast cancer outcomes. And not only was breast cancer survival significantly greater, the women also experienced a reduction in heart disease and a reduction in diabetes as a little side bonus. Both the Women's Intervention Nutrition Study and the Women's Health Initiative Study showed that women randomized to a lower-fat diet enjoyed improved breast cancer-free survival. But wait a second, what about the Women's Healthy Eating and Living Study, where women with breast cancer were also randomized to drop their fat intake down to 15 to 20% of calories, yet after 7 years there was no difference in breast cancer relapse or death? Anytime you get an unexpected result, you always have to question whether people actually followed through with the instructions. Like if you randomize people to a stop smoking group and they ended up with the same lung cancer rates as the group not instructed to stop smoking, one likely explanation is that the group told to stop smoking didn't actually stop. In the Women's Healthy Eating and Living Study, both the dietary intervention group and the control group started out at about 30% of calories from fat. Then the diet group was told to drop down to 15 to 20%, and by the end of the study they dropped from 28.5% fat all the way down to 28.9% fat? They didn't change at all. No wonder they didn't experience any breast cancer benefit. But even if you include that flawed study and put all the trials together on the effect of lower-fat diets on breast cancer survival, you see a reduced risk of breast cancer relapse and a reduced risk of death. Conclusion: going on a low-fat diet after a breast cancer diagnosis can improve breast cancer survival by reducing risk of cancer recurrence. And now, perhaps, we know why, by targeting metastasis-initiating cancer cells through the fat receptor CD36, which I covered in my last 2 videos. We know that the cancer-spreading receptor is upregulated by saturated fat. Is there anything in our diet that can downregulate it? Broccoli. Broccoli appeared to decrease CD36 expression by as much as 35%, but that was in mice. But of all fruits and vegetables, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli were the only ones associated with significantly less total cancer risk, and not just getting cancer in the first place. Those with bladder cancer who eat broccoli appear to live longer than those who don't. Those with lung cancer who eat more cruciferous veggies appear to survive longer as well. For example, 1 year out, about 75% of lung cancer patients eating more than one serving of cruciferous vegetables a day were still alive, whereas by then, most who had been getting less than a half serving a day were already dead, killed off by their cancer. Ovarian cancer. Cruciferous vegetable intake significantly favored survival, whereas a survival disadvantage was shown for meats. Milk also appeared to double the risk of dying. Here are the survival graphs. 8 years out, for example, about 40% of ovarian cancer patients who averaged meat or milk every day were dead, compared to only about 20% who just had meat or milk a few times a week at most. Now, it could just be that the fat and cholesterol on the meat increase circulating estrogen levels, or because of meat's growth hormones, or all the carcinogens, and galactose, the sugar naturally found in milk, may also be directly toxic to the ovary, and dairy's got all the hormones too. However, the lowering of risk with broccoli and the increasing of risk with meat and dairy are also consistent with the CD36 mechanism of cancer spread we've been talking about. So how about putting it to the test? Patients with advanced pancreatic cancer given pulverized broccoli sprouts or placebo. Compared to those in the placebo group, the average death rate was lower in the broccoli group. After a month, 18% of the placebo group was dead, but none in the broccoli group. By 3 months, another quarter of the placebo group had died, but still not a single death in the broccoli group. And by 6 months, 43% of the remaining patients in the placebo group were dead, along with the first 25% of the broccoli group. Unfortunately, the patients knew which group they were in because they were evidently getting broccoli burps, which gave it away, so you can't discount the placebo effect, and they weren't even properly randomized, since many of the patients refused to participate unless they were placed in the active treatment group, which is understandable, but it makes for a less rigorous result. But hey, a little broccoli can't hurt. And it's the no downside that leads to advising women undergoing treatment for breast cancer, for example, to include the liberal culinary use of cruciferous vegetables, and the same for reducing saturated fat. Is it time to give breast cancer patients a prescription for a low-fat diet? Although counseling women to consume a healthy diet after breast cancer diagnosis is certainly warranted for general health, read an editorial in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, the existing data still fall a bit short of proving this will help reduce the risk of breast cancer recurrence and mortality. But what do you have to lose? After all, it's still certainly warranted for general health. Medical marijuana, a panacea or scourge? For 5,000 years, cannabis has been used throughout the world for medicinal purposes, even prescribed by American physicians early on, a fact that's often used by medical marijuana proponents to justify modern medical applications. But the field of old-timey medicine was fraught with patent medicine snake oil nonsense, not to mention bloodletting and other questionable and harmful remedies. Skeptics criticized the medical marijuana movement as the medical excuse marijuana movement, insinuating that epileptic children and the terminally ill are just being used as props to Trojan horse in the legalization of recreational use, or to peddle outlandish claims about miracle cancer cures, frustrating researchers in the field who just want to get at the science. For example, what about the therapeutic use of cannabis for inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis? Conventional therapies mainly work by suppressing the immune system to try to tamp down the inflammation. Given the limited therapy options and known adverse side effects from these drugs, often people suffering these diseases ended up having to get inflamed sections of their bowels removed surgically. So you can see why there's so much interest in alternative approaches. About 1 in 6 IBD patients who use marijuana say it helps with their symptoms, so researchers decided to put it to the test. 13 patients with inflammatory bowel disease were given 1/3 of a pound of marijuana to smoke at their leisure over a period of 3 months, and they felt significantly better. Now, there's no control groups. You don't know if they would have gotten better anyway, or what role the placebo effect may have played. It's like some of the studies of cannabis use for pediatric epilepsy. Response rates of over 30%, seizure frequency cut in half in 1/3 of the kids. That's amazing! Until you realize you can sometimes get the same kind of amazing response giving kids nothing, giving them a sugar pill placebo. That's why it's critical to do randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, but there weren't any on cannabis and IBD until 2013. 21 patients with Crohn's disease for which nothing seemed to help, so they randomized them to either smoke 2 joints a day of real pot or a look-alike placebo pot. And 90% of the subjects in the cannabis group got better, compared to only 40% in the placebo group. Here's a graph of their symptom scores. No big change in the placebo group over the 2-month study, but the cannabis group cut their symptoms in half. They acknowledge that long-term cannabis use is not without risks, but may be a cakewalk compared to the potential adverse and even life-threatening side effects of some of the more powerful conventional therapies, so the study was heralded as offering high hope for digestive disorders. Now, the study was funded by a medical marijuana advocacy organization, in fact the main supplier in the country, and so there may have been expectations placed on the subjects on how much better this stuff was going to make them feel. In other words, a setup for the placebo effect. But they controlled for that, right? Those getting the real stuff did significantly better than those randomized to get the placebo pot. Oh, wait a second. The whole point of a placebo is to be indistinguishable from the real thing, so the subjects don't know which group they're really in. How do you do that with a psychoactive drug? You can't, which is the problem. They tried to hide which group people were in by recruiting only patients who never tried pot before in hopes that they wouldn't notice, but of course most of them did. So what we're left with is basically another unblinded study. They asked them a bunch of subjective questions, how you feeling? And those who mostly knew they were taking the drug said they were feeling better. There was no change in the objective lab values, like CRP, a sign of inflammation. And so maybe the marijuana is just masking symptoms without actually affecting intestinal inflammation. Another indicator that cannabis may not be affecting the course of the disease itself is how quickly the symptoms rebounded. 2 weeks after the study ended, the cannabis group was right back up to where they started. So no difference in objective inflammatory markers, and given the rapid rebound, it seems more plausible that cannabis ameliorated the symptoms of Crohn's disease rather than actually modulating the disease itself. OK, yeah, but the symptoms are terrible. A reduction in pain is a reduction in pain. From the point of view of the patients, a marked symptomatic improvement and ability to resume normal life is not trivial, whether or not the inflammation persists. Unless, of course, cannabis somehow made the disease worse in the long run. And this survey study, published the following year, found that cannabis provided that same immediate symptomatic relief, but was associated with a worse disease prognosis over time. Patients with inflammatory bowel disease reported that cannabis improved their pain, cramping, and diarrhea, but use for more than 6 months in Crohn's patients appeared to be a strong predictor of them ending up in surgery, 5 times the odds of them ending up under the knife. Now, there's 2 possible explanations for this. It's quite possible that it was the increased severity that led to the cannabis use, and not the other way around. But the alternative explanation is that cannabis use may worsen the prognosis, leading to greater surgeries and hospitalizations. That's why we really need prospective clinical trials where we follow people over time to see which came first. But until then, maybe we should consider cannabis use in IBD as potentially harmful. Not just to err on the side of caution, but there was this other study on hepatitis C patients that found that daily cannabis use was associated with nearly 7 times the odds of worse liver fibrosis, which is like scar tissue. And so, hey, if cannabis really does make fibrosis worse, then that could potentially explain why cannabis users with IBD may be more likely to end up on the operating table. For over a century, fasting has been espoused as a treatment of supposed great utility in the preservation of health, especially rejuvenating the body, but above all, the mind. But fast people even just 18 hours, and they get all hungry and irritable. After 1 or 2 days, positive mood goes down, negative mood goes up, and by 72 hours, people can feel sad, self-blaming, and suffer a loss of libido. But then something strange starts to happen. After a few days, people experience a fasting-induced mood enhancement, decreased anxiety, depression, fatigue, and improved vigor. And that's what studies tend to show across the board. Once you get over the hump, fasters frequently experience an increased level of vigilance and mood improvement, a subjective feeling of well-being, and sometimes even euphoria. And no wonder, as by then your endorphin levels may shoot up nearly 50%. This enhancement of mood, alertness, and calm makes a certain amount of evolutionary sense. Yet your body wants you to feel crappy initially, so you continue eating day to day when food is available. But if you go a couple days without food, your body realizes it can't have you moping back in the cave. You've got to get motivated to get out there and find some calories. So, can fasting be used for mood disorders like depression? Yeah, it's great that you can get people to feel better after a few days of fasting, but the critical question revolves around the persistence of mood improvement over time once you start eating again. You don't know until you put it to the test. Interestingly, the little published evidence we have comes out of Japan and the former Soviet Union, and some of it is just ridiculous. Like this study, which included women with a variety of symptoms, which the researchers blame mostly on marital conflict. Oh, husband not treating you right? How about a little electroshock therapy? That didn't seem to help much, though, so what about hunger therapy? Of course, starving those women made them hungry, but that's what Thorazine is for. If you keep injecting them with an antipsychotic to calm them down, they can sail right through. So what happened? Who cares what happened? What do we even do with those results, right? But this other study skipped the Thorazine. 10 days of fasting, but they also kept them in bed all day, completely isolated, with no contact with the outside world. So yeah, if people got better or worse, it'd be impossible to tease out the effects of just the fasting component, but they did apparently get better, with efficacy supposedly demonstrated in 31 out of 36 patients suffering from depression. They conclude that fasting therapy may provide an alternative to the use of antidepressant drugs, considering it a kind of shock therapy. People are so relieved to just be eating again, to get out of solitary confinement, to even just get out of bed, they report feeling better. Yeah, but that was at the time of discharge. How did they feel the next day, the next week, the next month? Fasting is, by definition, unsustainable, so ideally what we want to see is some kind of longer-lasting effects. So what the researchers did was follow up with a few hundred patients, not just a few months later, but a few years later. Of the 69 who were evidently suffering from depression, 90% reported feeling good or excellent results at the end of the 10-day fast, and remarkably, years later, 87% of the 62 that replied claimed that they were still doing good. Now, there was no control group, so we don't know if they would have done just as well or better without the fast. And it was just self-report, so maybe there was response bias, where you try to please the researcher. Or maybe they were afraid otherwise they'd get sent back to the hole. We have no idea, but we do have good evidence for the short-term mood benefits. The question is why. In addition to the endorphins when you fast, the surge in serotonin, the so-called happiness hormone, there's a bump In BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, considered to play a crucial role in mood disorders. And it's not just because you perk up rodents with it. Humans with major depression have lower levels circulating in their bloodstream. Autopsy studies of suicide victims show only about half the BDNF in certain key brain regions compared to controls, suggesting it may play an important role in suicidal behavior. You can boost BDNF with antidepressant drugs and electroshock, or with calorie restriction, a 70% boost in levels after 3 months cutting 25% of calories out of their daily diet. But is there anything we can add to our diets to boost BDNF levels so we can get the benefits without the hunger? We'll find out next. There's accumulating evidence that brain-derived neurotrophic factor may be playing a role in human depression. BDNF controls the growth of new nerve cells, and so low levels may explain the atrophy of specific brain areas you see among depressed patients. That may be one of the reasons exercise is so good for our brains. Start an hour-a-day exercise regimen, and within 3 months you can get a quadrupling of BDNF reliefs from your brain. This makes sense. Anytime we were desperate to catch prey, or desperate not to become prey ourselves, we needed to be cognitively sharp. And so when we're fasting, or exercising, or in a negative calorie balance, our brain starts churning out BDNF to make sure we're firing on all cylinders. So of course, Big Pharma is eager to create drugs to mimic this effect, but is there any way to boost BDNF naturally? Yes, I just said it, fasting and exercise. OK, but is there anything we can add to our diet to boost BDNF? Well, higher intakes of dietary flavonoids appear to be protectively associated with symptoms of depression. The Harvard Nurses study followed tens of thousands of women for years and found that those who were eating the most appeared to reduce their risk of coming down with depression. Flavonoids occur naturally in plants, so there's a substantial amount in a variety of healthy foods, but wait, how do we know the benefits are from the flavonoids and not just from eating healthier in general? You don't know until you put it to the test. See, some fruits and vegetables have more than others. Apples have more than apricots, plums more than peaches, red cabbage more than white, kale more than cucumbers. So if you randomize people into one of 3 groups, more high flavonoid fruits and vegetables, more low flavonoid fruits and vegetables, or no extra fruits and vegetables at all, after 18 weeks, only the high flavonoid group got a significant boost in BDNF levels, which corresponded to an improvement in cognitive performance. The BDNF boost may help explain why each additional daily serving of fruits and vegetables is associated with a 3% decrease in the risk of depression. A teaspoon a day of the spice turmeric may boost BDNF levels more than 50% within a month, consistent with the other randomized controlled trials that have so far been done. Nuts may help too. In the Predimed study, where people were randomized to be sent weekly batches of nuts or extra virgin olive oil, the nut group lowered their risk of having low BDNF levels by 78%. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor is not just implicated in depression, but schizophrenia as well. Have those with schizophrenia undergo a 12-week exercise program, and they get a significant boost in BDNF levels, leading the researchers to suggest that exercise-induced modulation of BDNF may play an important role in developing non-pharmacological treatment for chronic schizophrenia patients. OK, but what actually happened to their schizophrenia symptoms? Let's find out. 30 individuals with schizophrenia randomized to ramp up to 40 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 times a week, or not, and there did appear to be an improvement in psychiatric symptoms such as hallucinations, as well as increasing their quality of life. In fact, you can actually visualize what happened in their brains. Loss of brain volume in a certain region appears to be a feature of schizophrenia, but 30 minutes of exercise 3 times a week, and you can get up to a 20% increase in size of that region within 3 months. Calorie restriction may also increase BDNF levels in schizophrenics, but they didn't just have them eat less, but eat healthier, less saturated fat and sugar, and more fruits and veggies. It's like the Soviet fasting trials for schizophrenia. They reported these truly unbelievable results, supposedly restoring people to function. Fasting described as an unparalleled unparalleled achievement in the treatment of schizophrenia. OK, but part of the problem is that the diagnostic system the Soviets used is completely different, making end results hard to interpret, but they do have a subgroup that does seem to correspond to the Western definition, and they still report between 40 and 60% improvement rates from fasting. But that's not all they did. After being fasted for up to a month, they were put on a meat and egg-free diet. So when they report these remarkable effects even years later, that's for those who stuck with the diet. Those who broke the diet evidently relapsed, and the closer the diet was followed, the better the effect. They note that not all patients were able to remain vegetarian, but they tried to keep meat to a minimum. And look, we know from randomized controlled trials that just removing meat and eggs can improve mental states with even just 2 weeks. And so it's hard to know what role the fasting itself played in the reported improvements. A single high-fat meal can drop BDNF levels within hours, and you can prove it's the fat itself by seeing the same thing injecting fat straight into their veins. Perhaps that helps explain why increased consumption of saturated fats in a high-fat diet may contribute to brain dysfunction, neurodegenerative diseases, long-term memory loss, cognitive impairment. Maybe that helps explain why the standard American diet has been linked to a higher risk of depression, dietary factors modulating the levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. In a recent review of the damaging effects of household cleaning products on the lungs, researchers noted that the adverse respiratory effects of cleaning products were first observed in populations experiencing high levels of exposure at the workplace, such as cleaners and healthcare workers, with a primary focus on asthma. But the occupational use of disinfectants has also been linked to a higher risk of developing chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases like emphysema. And now we know it's not just workplace exposures, but also common household exposures that are risk factors for respiratory disorders in childhood, as well potentially an important risk factor for adult asthma, with common household cleaning spray use accounting for as many as 1 in 7 adult asthma cases. The thought is that the inhalation of chemical irritants may cause injury of the airways that leads to oxidative stress and inflammation. OK, so what can we do about it? Well, it may indeed be limited to sprays. Cleaning products not applied in spray form were not associated with asthma, and it's possible that environmentally friendly cleaning products may represent a safer alternative, though they may still present some risk. Ideally, safer cleaning products should be available. Unfortunately, the research suggesting harm has seldom been heeded by manufacturers, vendors, and commercial cleaning companies. I wonder how much of that is because most of the workers exposed to cleaning products, both occupationally and presumably domestically, are women. One of the problems may be the fragrance chemicals. 1 in 3 Americans surveyed reported health problems such as migraine headaches and respiratory difficulties when exposed to fragranced products. And in about half, it was so bad they actually lost work over it. Results from this study reveal that more than 1/3 of Americans suffer adverse health effects, such as respiratory difficulties and migraine headaches, from exposure to fragrance products. Of all individuals, half reported that the effects can be disabling, yet more than 99% of Americans are exposed to fragrance products at least once a week. The effect on asthmatics may be even worse, affecting closer to 2/3. One compound that may be of particular concern is called 1,4-dichlorobenzene, also known as para-dichlorobenzene, which is found in many air fresheners, toilet bowl deodorants, and mothballs. It breaks down in the body into a compound called 2,5-dichlorophenol, which you pee out, giving researchers a reliable measure of your dichlorobenzene exposure. Not only may it make respiratory problems worse for those already suffering from compromised airways, but exposure to dichlorobenzene at blood levels found in the general U.S. population may result in reduced lung function in people who start out with normal breathing. What's worse, higher exposure was associated with greater prevalence of cardiovascular disease and cancer. Well, that's not good, so better read the labels, right? Surprisingly, there is no law in the U.S. that requires the disclosure of all ingredients in fragrance consumer products. In fact, for air fresheners, laundry supplies, and cleaning products, they don't even need to say it has fragrance at all. You don't know until you smell it. So if you can't tell which products have which chemicals, you can follow the lead of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Not only is cigarette smoking indoors prohibited at all times, scented or fragrance products are also prohibited at all times in all interior space owned, rented, or leased by the CDC. I wish rideshare services like Uber and Lyft would have a similar policy, or at least a fragrance-free option. But 1 in 5 of more than 1,000 Americans surveyed said they would turn right around and leave a business if they smelled air fresheners or some fragrance product. So it's in business's best interest, too, since more than 50% of the population would prefer that workplaces, healthcare facilities and their healthcare professionals, hotels, and airplanes were fragrance-free. About a decade ago, the American Heart Association expressed concern that their 2020 target of improving cardiovascular health by 20% by 2020 would not be reached if current trends continued. By 2006, most people were already not smoking and had nearly achieved their goal for exercise, but when it came to healthy diet score, only about 1% got a 4 or 5 out of their 0 to 5 diet quality score, and that's with so-called ideal criteria being like drinking less than 4.5 cups of soda a week. In the last decade, they saw a bump up to like 1% of Americans even reaching this kind of basic criteria. But given their aggressive goal of improving that by 20% by 2020, they hope to turn that 1% into like 1.2%. OK, so how'd we do? Let's look at the 2019 update, and it looks like we've slipped down to as low as 1 in 1,000. You can't even see the green anymore, and American teens got a big fat 0. No wonder, perhaps, that for all mortality-based metrics, the U.S. rank declined like 27th or 28th among 34 industrialized countries. Citizens living in countries with a substantially lower GDP and health expenditures per capita have lower mortality rates than those in the United States. Slovenia beat us by 3 countries, coming in at 24th in life expectancy to our 27th. And more recently, we seem to have slipped to 43rd, even though we spend trillions on healthcare, more than anyone else. What's the leading risk factor for death in the United States? What we eat. The standard American diet is just to die for, literally. Those trillions in healthcare spending aren't addressing the root cause. Look at some of these beautiful lung cancer death curves. It took decades to finally turn the corner, but it's so nice to finally see those drops. When are we going to see the same with diet? Approximately 80% of chronic disease and premature death could be prevented by not smoking, being physically active, and adhering to a healthful dietary pattern. But what exactly is meant by a healthy diet? Unfortunately, what we hear about nutrition in the media is often inconsistent and confusing. There's a pressure within today's competitive journalism market for sensationalism. There may even be a disincentive to prevent the facts in context to sell more magazines. And this paper was written back in 1997, before the lure of clickbait headlines. In fact, about 3/4 of a century ago, it was noted that, unfortunately, the subject of nutrition seems to have a special appeal to the credulous, the social zealot, and, in the commercial field, the unscrupulous, a combination calculated to strike despair in the hearts of the sober objective scientist. The most important healthcare problem we face may be our poor lifestyle choices based on misinformation. It's like the climate change deniers. Healthy dietary advice is overshadowed by critics, diet books, industry interests, and misguided information in the media. Maybe what we need is like an IPCC of nutrition. These days, no single expert, regardless of academic stature or reputation, has the prominence to overcome the obstacles created by confusing media messages and effectively deliver the fundamental principles of healthy living to the public. However, what if there was a global coalition consisting of a variety of nutrition experts who collectively represent the views held by the majority of scientists, physicians, and health practitioners? It could serve as a guiding resource of sound nutrition information for improved health and prevention of disease. Boom! The True Health Initiative was conceived for that very purpose. A nonprofit coalition of hundreds of experts from dozens of countries agreeing to a consensus statement on the fundamentals of healthy living. Check out www.truehealthinitiative.org. Spoiler alert, the healthiest diet is one generally comprised mostly of minimally processed plants. Today, when grocery shopping, unless you're sticking to the produce aisle, it's nearly impossible to avoid processed foods, particularly if you're eating the standard American diet, characterized not only by insufficient plant foods and too much meat, dairy, and eggs, but also lots of processed junk, and along with that, an increased exposure to food additives. For example, the artificial sweetener sucralose, sold as Splenda, can disrupt the human gut microbiome and induce glucose intolerance. In other words, it can make your blood sugars worse instead of better. It's relatively easy to avoid artificial sweeteners, but it may be more difficult to avoid ingestion of emulsifiers, because they're commonly added to so many foods. In fact, emulsifiers are the most widely used food additives, and most processed foods contain one or more of them. We now consume emulsifiers by the megaton every year, thanks to a multi-billion-dollar industry. You'll commonly find emulsifiers in fatty dressings, fatty spreads, baked goods, mayonnaise, salad dressings, candy, and beverages. Why do we care? Like all authorized food additives, emulsifiers have been evaluated by risk assessors who consider them as safe. However, there are growing concerns among scientists about their potentially harmful effects on our intestinal barrier in terms of causing a leaky gut, as well as their effects on our microbiome. Moreover, they could possibly increase the absorption of environmental toxins present in the food. We know that the consumption of ultra-processed foods may be a contributor to weight gain, for example. Healthier, longer-lived populations don't just have low meat intake and high plant intake, but they're eating minimally processed foods. Maybe the emulsifiers found in processed foods could be playing a role, based on a number of preclinical studies. But who cares if emulsifiers make rats gain weight? When you read emulsifiers can cause striking changes in the microbiota, they're not talking about within human beings. Mice are often used to study diet's impact on the microbiome, but we only share a few % of bacterial genes in common. Even the gut flora of different mouse strains can be considerably different from each other. So if you can't even extrapolate from one type of mouse to another, how are you supposed to translate results from mice to human beings? Remarkably, there's been little study of the potential harmful effects of ingested emulsifiers in us. For example, lecithin, perhaps best known as a key component of egg yolks, was found to be worse than polysorbate 80 in terms of allowing bacteria to leak through the gut wall into the bloodstream. But whether lecithin consumption in humans causes the same problem is yet to be determined. There's certainly a paucity of human trials on the effects of emulsifiers and processed foods, but we at least have data on human tissue, cells, and gut flora. Dietary emulsifiers directly alter the composition of the human microbiome ex vivo, potentiating intestinal inflammation. Ex vivo means outside the body. Researchers inoculated an artificial gut with fresh human feces until they had a nice stable culture going, and then added carboxymethylcellulose, or polysorbate 80, and got a boost in pro-inflammatory potential starting within 1 day with the carboxymethylcellulose, and within the first week with polysorbate 80. This approach revealed that both emulsifiers acted directly upon human gut bugs to increase their pro-inflammatory potential. If you then test the effect of these emulsifiers on the protective mucus layer in petri dish cultures of human gut lining cells, you'll find that they can partially disrupt the protecting layer. The green staining is the mucus, and both emulsifiers cut down the levels. But both this study and the last used emulsifier concentrations that were far in excess of what people might typically get day to day. This is probably the study that raised the greatest potential concern. The researchers surgically obtained not just cells, but actual intestinal wall tissue, and found that polysorbate 80 could double the invasion of E. coli through the intestinal lining tissue, whereas adding fiber, in this case fiber from plantains, could seal up the gut wall tissue twice as tight. Moringa is a plant commonly known as the miracle tree, due to its purported healing powers across a spectrum of diseases. If miracle isn't hyperbolic enough for you, on the internet it's also known as God's gift to man. Is moringa a miracle or just a mirage? The enthusiasm for the health benefits of moringa is in dire contrast with the scarcity of strong experimental and clinical evidence supporting the claims. Fortunately, the chasm is slowly being filled. There's been a surge in scientific publications on moringa. In the last 10 years, the number of articles is closer to 1,000. But what got my attention was the presence of glucosinolates, compounds that boost our liver's detoxifying enzymes. I thought they were only found in cruciferous vegetables like cabbage, broccoli, kale, collards, and cauliflower, but no. It turns out they're also found in the moringa family, with potency comparable to broccoli. That's exciting, but why not just eat broccoli rather than mail-ordering some exotic moringa powder? Is there anything special about moringa? It's been described as the most nutritious tree yet discovered. How much is that saying, though? I mean, who eats trees? Supposedly, moringa contains higher amounts of nutrients than most conventional sources, 10 times the vitamin A of carrots, 12 times the vitamin C of oranges, 17 times more calcium than milk, 15 times more potassium than bananas, 25 times more iron than spinach, and 9 times more protein than yogurt. First of all, even if all this were true, this is for 100 grams of dry moringa leaf. That's like 14 tablespoons, almost a whole cup of leaf powder. Researchers have had trouble getting people to even eat 20 grams, and so anything more would likely result in an excessively unpleasant taste due to the bitterness of the leaves. And secondly, the nutritional claims in these papers are quote-unquote adapted from Fugly, which evidently is just some lay publication. If you go to the USDA nutrient database, though, and enter a more doable dose, like the amount you might get in a smoothie, about 1 tablespoon for instance, a serving of moringa powder has as much vitamin A as a quarter of 1 baby carrot, and as much vitamin C as 1/100th of an orange. So an orange has as much vitamin C as 100 tablespoons of moringa. A serving of moringa powder only has the calcium of half a cup of milk, the potassium of not 15 bananas, but a quarter of 1 banana, the iron of a quarter cup of spinach, and the protein of a third of a container of yogurt. So yeah, it may be nutritious, but not off the charts, and certainly not what's commonly touted. So again, why not eat broccoli? It's got the A, C, calcium, potassium, iron, and protein of broccoli. Moringa does seem to have anti-cancer activity in a petri dish against cell lines of breast cancer, lung cancer, skin cancer, and fibrosarcoma, while tending to leave normal cells relatively alone, but there hasn't been any clinical studies. Well, what's the point in finding out that moringa enhances the sexual performance of stressed rats? What are you supposed to do with that? Studies like this one, though, started to make things a little interesting. Researchers were testing the effects of a tablespoon moringa leaf powder once a day for 3 months on antioxidant status, and saw a drop in oxidative stress, as one might expect from eating any healthy plant food. But they also saw a drop in fasting blood sugars from pre-diabetic levels over 100 to more normal levels. Now, that's interesting. I mean, should we start recommending a daily tablespoon of moringa powder to diabetics? Was it just a fluke? Moringa and blood sugar control, a review of the current evidence, next. Clearly, in spite of the widely held belief in the health benefits of moringa, the interest of the international biomedical community, the medicinal potential of this plant, has been rather tepid. Spectacularly hesitant, in fact, in exploring its nutritional and medicinal potential. Other superfoods, such as garlic and green tea, have enjoyed better reception, but they also have more scientific support. There are thousands of human studies on garlic and more than 10,000 on green tea, but only a few hundred on moringa. The most promising appears to be on the effects of moringa on blood sugar control. If you have people eat about 5 cookies, this is the kind of blood sugar spike you get. Add about 2 teaspoons of moringa leaf powder into the cookie batter, and even with the same amount of sugar and carbs, the blood sugar surge is dampened. Just having people drink 1 or 2 cups of moringa leaf tea before a sugar challenge suppressed the elevation in blood sugar in all cases compared to those who drank plain water instead. Here's the spike after sugar with no moringa. Here's the reaction to the same amount of sugar 30 minutes after drinking moringa tea. No wonder moringa is used in traditional medicine practice for diabetes, but you don't really know if it can help until you put it to the test. Diabetics were given about 3/4 of a teaspoon of moringa leaf powder every day for 12 weeks, and got significant improvements in measures of inflammation, as well as long-term blood sugar control. But the reason they call it a quasi-experimental study is because there was no control group. The researchers just took measurements before and after, and we know that just being in a dietary study can lead some people to consciously or unconsciously eat more healthfully, so we don't know what effect the moringa itself had. Even in moringa studies with a control group, it's not clear if the subjects were randomly allocated. And in this study, the researchers didn't specify how much moringa people were even given. I mean, what does 1 tablet's worth mean? No significant improvement in this study. Maybe they didn't give enough. This study used a tablespoon a day, and not only saw a significant drop in fasting blood sugars, but a significant drop in LDL cholesterol as well. 2 teaspoons a day didn't seem to help, so was it just that a whole tablespoon is needed? Apparently not, since finally a randomized, placebo-controlled study using a tablespoon of moringa a day failed to show any benefit on blood sugar control in type 2 diabetics. So we're left with a few studies showing potential, but most failing to show benefit. Why not just give moringa a try to see for yourself? That's a legitimate course of action in the face of conflicting data when we're talking about safe, simple, side effect-free solutions. But is moringa safe? Probably not during pregnancy, as about 80% of womenfolk in some areas of the world use it to abort pregnancies, and its effectiveness for that purpose has been confirmed, at least in rats, though breastfeeding women may get about a half-cup boost in milk production based on 6 randomized, placebo-controlled, blinded clinical trials. Just because moringa has long been used in folk medicine traditions in no way proves that the plant is safe to consume. Lots of horribly toxic stuff like mercury and lead, for instance, have been used in traditional medical systems the world over. But hey, at least no major harmful effects of moringa have been reported by the scientific community, or more accurately, no adverse effects were reported in any of the human studies that have been conducted to date. In other words, no harmful effects have been reported until now. Stevens-Johnson syndrome following moringa leaf consumption. Stevens-Johnson syndrome is probably the most dreaded drug side effect, a rare but potentially fatal condition characterized by epidermal detachment. In other words, it can make your skin fall off. 14 hours after consuming moringa, a guy broke out. The same thing had happened 3 months earlier, the last time he had eaten moringa, causing him to suffer extensive lesions with blister formation over his face, mouth, chest, abdomen, and genitalia. This case report suggests that consumption of moringa leaf is better avoided by individuals who are at risk of developing Stevens-Johnson. Although it can happen to anyone, HIV is a risk factor. My take on moringa is that the evidence of benefit wasn't compelling enough to justify shopping online for something special when you can get healthy vegetables in your local market, like broccoli, which has yet to be implicated in any genital blistering. There is a toxin in plain white button mushrooms called agarotine, which may be carcinogenic. And plain white button mushrooms grow up to be cremini mushrooms, the brown mushrooms, and cremini mushrooms grow up to be portobello mushrooms. They're all the exact same mushroom. It's like how green bell peppers are just unripe red bell peppers. But you can reduce the amount of garotine in these shrooms through cooking. Frying, microwaving, boiling, or even just freezing and thawing lowers the levels. is therefore recommended to cook mushrooms before consumption, something I noted in a video that's now more than a decade old. But if you look at the various cooking methods, the agarotene isn't completely destroyed. Take dry baking, for example, 10 minutes at about 400 degrees Fahrenheit, basically how you'd make a pizza, only cuts the agarotene levels by about a quarter, so 77% still remains. Boiling looks better, appearing to wipe out over half of the toxin after just 5 minutes, but it's not actually wiped out. Instead, it's just transferred to the cooking water. So yes, levels within the mushrooms drop by about half at 5 minutes and 90% after an hour, but that's mostly because it's leaching into the broth. So if you're making soup or something, 5 minutes of boiling is no better than the pizza, and even after an hour, about half remains. Frying for 5 to 10 minutes wipes out a lot, but microwaving is a more healthful way to cook, and it works even better. Just 1 minute in the microwave reduces the agarotene content of fresh sliced mushrooms by 65%, and only 30 seconds wipes out about half. So microwaving is probably the easiest way to reduce agarotene levels in fresh mushrooms. What I do with dried mushrooms is throw them into pasta water when I'm making spaghetti. Between the 20% drop from the drying and the 60% drop from boiling for 10 minutes and straining, more than 90% is wiped out. Should we be concerned about the residual agarotene? Should we skip mushroom pizza? If you're eating pizza, mushrooms are probably the last thing you need to worry about, but seriously, should we be concerned about agarotene? According to a review paid for by the mushroom industry, not at all. The available evidence to date suggests agarotene from consumption of mushrooms poses no known toxicological risk to healthy humans. The researchers acknowledge it's considered a potential carcinogen in mice, but then you have to extrapolate that data to human health outcomes. For example, the Swiss Institute of Technology estimated the average mushroom consumption in the country would be expected to cause about 2 cases of cancer per 100,000 people. That's actually similar to U.S. consumption, so one could theoretically expect about 20 cancer deaths per million lives from mushroom consumption. Now, typically with a new chemical, pesticide, or food additive, we'd like to see less than 1 in a million cancer risk. By this approach, the average mushroom consumption would be 20-fold too high to be acceptable. To get it down to 1 in a million, you could only eat about a half-cup serving once every 250 days or something to remain under the quote-unquote tolerable limit. But to put that into perspective, even if you were eating a single serving every single day, the resulting additional cancer risk would only be about 1 in 10,000. In other words, if 10,000 people consumed a mushroom meal daily for 70 years, then, in addition to the 3,000 cancer cases arising from other factors, 1 more case could be attributed to consuming mushrooms. But again, this is all based on the presumption that results in mouse models are valid in humans. This is all just extrapolating from mice. What we need is a huge prospective study to examine the association between mushroom consumption and cancer risk in people, but there weren't any such studies until now. Mushroom consumption and risk of cancer in the 2 large Harvard cohorts, and no association between mushroom intake and cancer. Eating raw or undercooked shiitake mushrooms can cause something else, though. Shiitake mushroom flagellate dermatitis. Flagellate as in flagellation, whipping, flogging. Check out this crazy rash. You break out in a rash that makes it look as if you've been whipped. Doesn't it look wild? That's just how you break out. It's thought to be caused by a compound in shiitake mushrooms called lentinin, but because heat denatures it, it only seems to be a problem with raw or undercooked mushrooms. Now, it's rare. Only about 1 in 50 people are even susceptible, and it goes away on its own in a week or 2. Interestingly, it can strike as many as 10 days after you eat them, which is why people may not make the connection. One poor guy suffered on and off for 16 years before a diagnosis. Hopefully, a lot of doctors will watch this video, and if they ever see a rash like this, they'll tell their patients to cook their shiitakes. The reason I make my pesto with walnuts instead of the more traditional pine nuts is not only because walnuts are probably healthier— we're talking 20 times more polyphenols— but also because of a mysterious phenomenon known as PMS. No, not that PMS. Pine mouth syndrome, characterized by what has become my favorite word of the week, cacageusia, meaning a bad taste in your mouth. You can get it from heavy metal toxicity, seafood toxins, certain nutritional and neurological disorders, or from eating the wrong kind of pine nuts. Termed pine mouth by the public, a few days after eating pine nuts, you get this persistent metallic or bitter taste in your mouth that can last for weeks. Thousands of cases have been reported. Raw versus cooked pine nuts doesn't seem to matter. Could the cause be some unidentified toxin present in some varieties of non-edible pine nuts? Out of more than 100 different kinds of pine trees, the nuts of only about 30 are considered to be edible. So pine nut samples from stricken consumers were analyzed, and indeed, they all contain nuts from Chinese white pine, which is not reported to be edible. That tree is typically only used for lumber. These are the good ones. These are the bad ones. It's like a game. Good, bad, good, good. You don't know it's the Chinese white pine nuts, though, until you put it to the test. Researchers had a few folks consume 6 to 8 Chinese white pine nuts. Most of the subjects hadn't ever heard of pine mouth syndrome, and boom, they all developed symptoms. And we still don't know exactly what it is in those nuts that causes such a weird reaction. We just know to stay away from those kind of pine nuts. So what kinds of pine nuts do we have on our shelves here? All kinds, apparently, including those associated with pine mouth. Good, 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 bad, good. So, unsurprisingly, hundreds of cases have been reported in the U.S. as well. Most of the implicated nuts were reportedly labeled as originating from Asia, and in most cases, China. Europe actually did something about it and demanded China stop sending them toxic nuts, which they did in 2011. And this export restriction likely resulted in less being imported into the U.S. as well, given the decline in cases going into 2012. Rare cases still happen, though, as evidenced by an active Facebook group entitled "Damn You Pine Nuts." The primary reason I made this video is just to allay fear should this ever happen to you. Although there are no proven therapies, pine mouth syndrome appears to be benign and just goes away on its own. Anyone can lose weight eating less food. Anyone can be starved thin. Starvation diets are rarely sustainable, though, since hunger pangs drive us to eat. We feel unsatisfied on low-calorie diets, unsatiated. We do have some level of voluntary control, but our deep-seated instinctual drives may win out in the end. For example, you can consciously hold your breath. Try it right now. How long can you go before your body's self-preservation mechanisms take over and overwhelm your deliberate intent not to breathe? Your body has your best interests at heart and is too smart to allow you to suffocate yourself, or starve yourself for that matter. If our body was really that smart, though, how could it let us become obese? Why doesn't our body realize when we're way too fat and allow us the leeway to slim down? Maybe our body is actually very aware and actively trying to help, but we're somehow undermining those efforts? How could we test this theory to see if that's true? So many variables go into choosing what we eat and how much. There are psychological, social, cultural, and aesthetic factors. To strip all that away and stick just to the physiological, Columbia University researchers designed a series of famous experiments using a food dispensing device. The term food is used very loosely here. Their feeding machine was a tube hooked up to a pump that delivered a mouthful of bland liquid formula every time you pushed a button. Research subjects were instructed to eat as much or as little as they wanted at any time. In this way, eating was reduced to just the rudimentary hunger drive, without the usual trappings of sociability, meal ceremony, and the pleasures of the palate. How much would people be driven to eat? Put a normal weight person in this scenario, and something remarkable happens. Day after day, week after week, with nothing more than their hunger to guide them, they eat exactly as much as they need, perfectly maintaining their weight. They needed about 3,000 calories a day, and that's just how much they unknowingly gave themselves. Their body just intuitively seemed to know how many times to press that button. Put an obese person in that same scenario, and something even more remarkable happens. Driven by hunger alone, with the enjoyment of eating stripped away, they wildly undershoot, giving themselves a mere 275 calories a day total. They could eat as much as they wanted, but they just weren't hungry. It's as if their body knew how massively overweight they were, so it dialed down their natural hunger drive to almost nothing. One subject started out at 400 pounds and steadily lost weight. After 252 days sipping the bland liquid, he lost 200 pounds. This groundbreaking discovery was initially interpreted to mean that obesity is not caused by some sort of metabolic disturbance driving people to overeat. In fact, the study suggested quite the opposite. Instead, overeating appeared to be a function of the meaning people attach to food beyond its use as fuel, whether as a source of pleasure, or perhaps relief from boredom or stress. In this way, obesity seemed more psychological than physical. Subsequent experiments with the feeding machine, though, flipped such conceptions on their head once again. If you take the lean study subjects and covertly double the calorie concentration of the formula, they unconsciously cut their consumption in half to continue to perfectly maintain their weight. Their body somehow detected the change in calorie load and sent signals to the brain to press the button half as often to compensate. Amazing. Do the same with obese persons, though, and nothing changes. They continue to drastically undereat just as much as before. Their body seems incapable of detecting or reacting to the change in calorie load, suggesting a physiological inability to regulate intake. Might the brains of obese persons somehow be insensitive to internal satiety signals? We don't know if it's cause or effect. Maybe that's why they're obese in the first place, or maybe the body knows how obese it is and is shutting down the hunger drive regardless of the calorie concentration. Indeed, the obese subjects continue to steadily lose weight eating out of the machine, regardless of the calorie concentration of the food being dispensed. It would be interesting to see if they regain the ability to respond to changing calorie intake once they reach their ideal weight. Regardless, what can we apply from these remarkable studies to facilitate weight loss out in the real world? We'll explore just that question next. The importance of satiety is underscored by a rare genetic condition known as Prader-Willi syndrome. Children with the disorder are born with impaired signaling between their digestive system and their brain, so they don't know when they're full. With no sensation of satiety, they can accidentally eat so much they fatally rupture their stomach. Without satiety, food can be a death sentence. Protein is often described as the most satiating macronutrient. People tend to report feeling fuller after eating a protein-rich meal compared to a carbohydrate or fat-rich one. The question is, does that feeling of fullness last? From a weight loss standpoint, satiety ratings only matter if they end up cutting down on subsequent calorie intake. And even a review funded by the meat, dairy, and egg industries acknowledged that this does not seem to be the case for protein. Hours later, the protein consumed earlier doesn't tend to end up cutting calories later on. Fiber-rich foods, on the other hand, can suppress appetite and reduce subsequent meal intake more than 10 hours later the next day, because its site of action is 20 feet down in the lower intestine. Remember the ileal brake from my evidence-based weight loss lecture? Secretly infused nutrients into the end of the small intestine, and people spontaneously eat as many as hundreds of fewer calories at a meal. Our brain gets the signal that we're full from head to tail. Remember, we were built for gluttony. It's a hedge against times of scarcity. Stumbling across a rare bounty, those who could stuff themselves the most to build up the greatest reserves would be more likely to pass along their genes. So we are hardwired, not just to eat until our stomach is full, but until our entire digestive tract is occupied. Only when our brain senses food all the way down at the end does our appetite fully dial down. Fiber-depleted foods get rapidly absorbed early on, though, so much of it never makes it down to the lower gut. So if we're eating low fiber, no wonder we're constantly hungry and overeating. Our brain keeps waiting for the food that never arrives. That's why even people who have stomach stapling surgeries, leaving them with a tiny 2-tablespoon-sized stomach pouch, can still eat enough to regain most of the weight they initially lost. Without sufficient fiber transporting nutrients all the way down our digestive tract, we may never be fully satiated. As I described in my last video, one of the most successful experimental weight loss interventions ever reported in the medical literature involved no fiber at all, though. What was going on with that? At first glance, it might seem like a no-brainer that removing the pleasurable aspects of eating would cause people to eat less. But remember, that's not what happened. The lean subjects continued to eat the same amount, taking in thousands of calories a day of the bland goop. Only those who were obese dropped from eating thousands of calories a day down to hundreds. This happened inadvertently, without them apparently even feeling a difference. Only after eating was disconnected from the reward was the body able to start rapidly reining in the weight. See, we appear to have two separate appetite control systems, the homeostatic system and the hedonic system. The homeostatic pathway maintains our calorie balance by making us hungry when energy reserves are low, and abolishes our appetite when energy reserves are high. In contrast, our hedonic, or reward-based regulation, can overwhelm our homeostatic pathway in the face of highly palatable foods. This makes total sense from an evolutionary standpoint. In the rare situations in our ancestral history when we'd stumble across some calorie-dense food like a cache of unguarded honey, it would make sense for our hedonic drive to jump into the driver's seat to gobble up the scarce commodity. Even if we didn't need the extra calories at the time, our bodies wouldn't want us to pass up that rare opportunity. Such opportunities aren't so rare anymore, though. With sugary fatty foods around every corner, our hedonic drive may end up in perpetual control, overwhelming the intuitive wisdom of our bodies. So, what's the answer? Never eat really good-tasting food? No, but it may help to recognize the effects hyper-palatable foods can have on hijacking our appetites and undermining our body's better judgment. Ironically, some researchers have suggested a counterbalancing evolutionary strategy for combating the lure of artificially concentrated calories. Just as pleasure can overrule our appetite regulation, so can pain. Conditioned food aversions are when we avoid foods that made us sick in the past. That may just seem like common sense, but it's actually a deep-seated evolutionary drive that can defy rationality. Even if we know for a fact a particular food was not the cause of an episode of nausea and vomiting, our body can inextricably tie the two together. This happens, for example, with cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. Consoling themselves with a favorite treat before treatment can lead to an aversion to their favorite food if their body tries to connect the dots. That's why oncologists may advise the scapegoat strategy of only eating foods before treatment you're OK with never wanting to eat again. Researchers have experimented with inducing food aversions by having people taste something before spinning them in a rotating chair to cause motion sickness. Eureka! A group of psychologists suggested this kind of strategy as a way of encouraging people to eat less unhealthy food, make them sick of the food by making them sick from the food. Or hey, what about using disgust to promote healthier eating? Children as young as 2.5 years old will throw out a piece of previously preferred candy scooped out of a brand new sparkling clean toilet bowl. Thankfully, there's a way to exploit your instinctual drives without resorting to revulsion, aversion, or bland food, which we'll explore next. How did we evolve to solve the daunting task of selecting a diet that supplies all of the essential nutrients? Dietary diversity. By eating a variety of foods, we increase our chances of hitting all the bases. If we only ate for pleasure, we might just stick with our favorite food to the exclusion of all others, but we have an innate tendency to switch things up. We end up eating more calories when provided with 3 different yogurt flavors than just one, even if that one is our chosen favorite. So variation can trump sensation. They don't call it the spice of life for nothing. It appears to be something we're born with. Studies on newly weaned infants dating back nearly a century show that babies naturally choose a variety of foods even over their preferred food. This tendency seems to be driven by a phenomenon known as sensory-specific satiety. Within 2 minutes of digging into a meal, the pleasantness of the taste, smell, texture, and appearance of the eaten food drops off compared to uneaten foods. It's like how the first bite of chocolate tastes better than the last bite. Our body tires of the same sensations and seeks out novelty by rekindling our appetite every time we're presented with new foods. This helps explain the dessert effect, where we can be stuffed to the gills, but gain a second wind when dessert arrives. What was adaptive for our ancient ancestors to maintain nutritional adequacy may be maladaptive in the age of obesity. Feed people a 4-course meal, and they eat 60% more calories than when presented with the same food at each course. It's not just that we're getting bored. Our body has a different physiological reaction. Give people a squirt of lemon juice, and their salivary glands respond with a squirt of saliva. But give someone lemon juice 10 times in a row, and they salivate less and less each time. Switch to the same amount of lime juice, though, and their salivation jumps right back up. We're hardwired to respond differently to new foods. On the same plate, at the same meal, or even on subsequent days. The greater the variety, the more we tend to eat. Give kids the same mac and cheese dinner 5 days in a row, and they end up eating hundreds of calories less by the 5th day, compared to kids who got a variety of different meals. Even just switching the shape of food can lead to overeating. Give kids a second bowl of mac and cheese, and they eat significantly more if you change from elbow macaroni to spirals. People allegedly eat up to 77% more M&Ms if you present them with 10 different colors instead of 7, even though all the colors taste the same. The greater the difference, though, the greater the effect. Alternating between sweet and savory foods can have a particularly appetite-stimulating effect. Do you see how, in this way, adding even a diet soda to a fast food meal can lead to overconsumption? The staggering array of modern food choices may be one of the factors conspiring to undermine our appetite control. There are now tens of thousands of different foods being sold. The so-called supermarket diet is actually one of the most successful ways to make rats fat. Researchers tried high-calorie food pellets, but the rats just ate less to compensate. So they therefore used a more extreme diet by feeding foods they bought at a nearby supermarket, like cookies, candy, bacon, and cheese, and the animals ballooned right up. The human equivalent to maximize experimental weight gain has been dubbed the cafeteria diet. It's kind of like the opposite of the original food dispensing device I've talked about before. Instead of all-you-can-eat bland liquid, researchers offered free all-you-can-eat access to elaborate vending machines stocked with 40 trays with a dizzying array of foods like pastries and French fries. Participants found it impossible to maintain energy balance consistently consuming more than 120% of their calorie requirements. Our understanding of sensory-specific satiety can be used to get people to gain weight, but how can we use it to our advantage? For example, would limiting the variety of unhealthy snacks help people lose weight? 2 randomized controlled trials made the attempt and failed to show significantly more weight loss in the reduced variety diets, but they also failed to get people to make much of a dent in their diets. Just cutting down on 1 or 2 snack types seems insufficient to make much of a difference. A more drastic change may be needed, which we'll cover next. When you eat the same food over and over, you become habituated to it and end up liking it less. That's why your 10th bite of chocolate, for example, doesn't taste as good as the first bite. We have a built-in biological drive to get us to keep changing up our foods, so we'll be more likely to hit all of our nutritional requirements. The drive is so powerful that even imagined consumption reduces actual consumption. If you have someone imagine they're eating cheese, for example, over and over, and then you give them actual cheese, they eat less of it than those who hadn't been imagining they were eating cheese. Ironically, habituation may be one of the reasons fad mono diets, like the cabbage soup diet and the oatmeal diet, or meal replacement shakes, can actually result in better adherence and lower ratings of hunger compared to less restrictive diets. In the landmark study, a satiety index of common foods, in which dozens of foods were put to the test, boiled potatoes were found to be the most satiating food. 240 calories of boiled potatoes were found to be more satisfying in terms of quelling hunger than the same number of calories of any other food tested. No other food even came close. No doubt, potatoes' low-calorie density played a role. For people to eat 240 calories of spuds, the researchers had to feed them nearly a pound of potatoes, compared to just a few cookies, for example. But that's kind of the point. They had to feed people even more apples, grapes, and oranges, though, yet each fruit was still about 40% less satiating than the potatoes. So, an all-potato diet would probably take the gold, the Yukon Gold, for the most bland, monotonous, and satiating diet. Mono diets, where you just eat one thing, are the poster child for unsustainability, however, and thank heavens for that. Over time, they can lead to serious nutrient deficiencies, like blindness from vitamin A deficiency in the case of white potatoes. The satiating power of potatoes can still be brought to bear, though. Boiled potatoes beat out rice and pasta in terms of a satiating side dish, cutting as much as about 200 calories of intake off a meal. Compared to boiled and mashed potatoes, French fries, or even baked ones, do not appear to have the same satiating impact. To exploit habituation for weight loss while maintaining nutrient abundance, you could limit the variety of unhealthy foods you eat while expanding the variety of healthy foods. In that way, you can simultaneously take advantage of the appetite-suppressing effects of monotony while diversifying your fruit and vegetable portfolio. Studies have shown that a greater variety of calorie-dense foods like sweets and snacks are associated with excess body fat, but a greater vegetable variety appeared protective. Presented with a greater variety of fruit, a greater variety of vegetables, and greater variety of vegetable seasonings, people may consume a greater quantity, crowding out less healthy options. For the first 20 years of the official dietary guidelines for Americans, they recommended generally eating a variety of foods. In the new millennium, they've started getting more precise, specifying a diversity of healthier foods only. As a pair of Harvard and NYU dietitians concluded in a paper on dietary variety as an overlooked strategy for obesity and chronic disease control, choose and prepare a greater variety of plant-based foods, recognizing that a greater variety of less healthy options could be counterproductive. So, how can we respond to industry attempts to lure us into temptation by turning our natural biological drives against us? Should we never eat really delicious food? No, but it may help to recognize the effects hyperpalatable foods can have on hijacking our appetites and undermining our body's better judgment. We can also use some of those same primitive impulses to our advantage by monotonizing our choices of the bad and diversifying our choices of the good. In How Not to Diet, I call it meatball monotony and veggie variety. Try picking out a new fruit or vegetable every time you shop. In my own family's home, we always have a wide array of healthy snacks on hand to entice the finickiest of tastes. The contrasting collage of colors and shapes and fruit baskets and vegetable platters beat out boring bowls of a single fruit because they make you want to mix it up and try a little of each. And with different healthy dipping sauces, the possibilities are endless. There are two components of psychological health: the absence of mental health disorders, such as depression, as well as the existence of positive psychological well-being. That's the focus of an emerging field of positive psychology, focusing on happiness, life satisfaction, and flourishing, which may translate to physical benefits such as improvements in blood pressure, immune function, and longevity. What is the contribution of food consumption to well-being? Well, studies have linked the consumption of fruits and vegetables with enhanced well-being. A systematic review of research found evidence that consuming fruits and vegetables was associated with increased psychological well-being. OK, but that's just an association. A famous criticism in this area of research is that maybe there's just some inherent personality trait or a type of family upbringing that might lead people simultaneously to eat in a healthy way and also to have better mental well-being. So the diet is merely correlated with, but incorrectly gives the appearance of helping to cause, the level of well-being. But recent research circumvented this problem by seeing if changes in diet are correlated with changes in mental well-being, in effect studying the evolution of well-being and happiness after increases in the consumption of fruits and vegetables. And look at that graph, a straight line increase between how much more fruits and veggies people started eating and their change in life satisfaction over time. Increased fruit and vegetable consumption appeared predictive of increased happiness, life satisfaction, and well-being, up to 0.24 life satisfaction points for an increase of 8 portions a day. What does that mean? Is that a lot? Is that a little? That's a lot, equal in size to the psychological gain of going from unemployed to getting a job. My daily dozen recommendation is for at least 9 servings of fruits and veggies a day. This study was done in Australia. It was repeated in the UK, and researchers there found the same thing, though the Brits may need to bump up their daily minimum to more like 10 or 11 servings a day. OK, but does eating fruits and veggies also reduce the risk of depression and anxiety? I mean, well-being is nice, but governments and medical authorities are often interested in the determinants of major mental illness, not life satisfaction, and indeed, using the same data set, but instead looking for mental illness, eating fruits and vegetables may help to protect against future risk of clinical depression and anxiety as well. A systematic review and meta-analysis of dozens of studies found that every 100-gram increased intake of fruit was associated with a 3% reduced risk of depression. That's about half an apple. Yet less than 10% of most Western populations even consume a bare minimum. Maybe the problem is we're just telling people about the long-term benefits of fruit intake for chronic disease prevention, rather than the near-immediate improvements in well-being. So maybe we should be advertising the happiness gains, but first we need to make sure they're real. We've been talking about associations. Yes, a healthy diet may reduce the risk of future depression or anxiety, but being diagnosed with depression or anxiety today could also lead to lower fruit and vegetable intake. Now, in these studies, you can indeed show that the increase in fruit and vegetable consumption came first, and not the other way around. But as the great Enlightenment philosopher pointed out, just because the cock crows before dawn doesn't mean the cock caused the sun to rise. To prove cause and effect, you need to put it to the test with an interventional study. Unfortunately, to date, many studies were like this, where those randomized to eat fruit showed significant improvements in anxiety and depression, fatigue, and emotional distress. Wow, amazing. But that was compared to chocolate and potato chips. Apples, clementines, and bananas making people feel better than assorted potato chips and chunky chocolate wafers. Not exactly a revelation. This is the kind of study I've been waiting for, a randomized controlled trial in which young adults were randomized to a diet-as-usual group, encouragement to eat more fruits and veggies, or a third group given 2 servings of fruits and vegetables a day to eat over and above their regular diet. And the ones given fruits and veggies showed improvements in their psychological well-being, with increases in vitality, flourishing, and motivation within just 2 weeks. However, simply educating people to eat their fruits and vegetables may not be enough to reap the full reward. So perhaps greater emphasis needs to be placed on actually providing people with fresh produce, for example, offering free fruit for people when they shop. I know that would certainly make me happy. Gastrointestinal symptoms like abdominal pain and bloating account for millions of doctor visits every year. One of the conditions that may be considered for such a nonspecific presentation of symptoms is SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, a concept that has gained popularity on the Internet. In addition to certain clinical research circles, SIBO is broadly defined as the excessive growth of bacteria in the small intestine, and is typically treated with antibiotics. But dispensing antibiotics to patients with such nonspecific common symptoms is not without risks. You could be fostering antibiotic resistance, there could be side effects, and wiping out your good bacteria could set you up for an invasion of bad bugs like C. diff, all for a condition that may not even be real. Even alternative medicine journals admit that SIBO is being overdiagnosed, creating confusion and fear. SIBO testing is overused and overly relied upon. Diagnoses are often handed out quickly and without adequate substantiation. Patients can be indoctrinated into thinking SIBO is a chronic condition that cannot be cleared and will require lifelong management. This is simply not true for most, and is an example of the damage done by overzealousness. The monster that we now perceive SIBO to be may be no more than a phantom. The traditional method for a diagnosis was a small bowel aspiration, an invasive test where a long tube is snaked down your throat to take a sample and count the bugs down there. This method has been almost entirely replaced with breath testing. See, normally a sugar called glucose is almost entirely absorbed in the small intestine, so it never makes it down to the colon. So if there is bacterial fermentation of that sugar, that suggests you have bacteria up in your small intestine, and can detect that fermentation because the bacteria produce specific gases that get absorbed in your bloodstream and then are breathed out from your lungs, which can then be detected with a breathalyzer-type machine. Previously, a sugar called lactulose was used, but lactulose breath tests weren't found to reliably detect the overgrowth of bacteria, so researchers switched to glucose. But when glucose was finally put to the test, it didn't work either. The bacterial load in the small intestine was similar for those testing positive or negative, so that's not a useful test either. It turns out glucose can make it down to your colon after all. They labeled the glucose dose with a tracer and found that almost half of the positive results from glucose breath tests were false positives, because they were just fermenting it down in their colon where your bacteria are supposed to be. So patients incorrectly labeled with SIBO may undergo multiple courses of antibiotics for a problem they don't even have. Why do experts keep recommending breath testing, then? Oh, you mean the experts at the conference supported by a breath testing company, most of whom had personally received funds from SIBO testing or antibiotic companies? And even if we could properly diagnose it, does it even matter? In those with digestive symptoms, there is a range of positivity for SIBO from approximately 4% to 84% all over the map, and there may be no difference in symptom scores between those testing positive versus those testing negative, so testing positive could mean anything. Who cares if some people have bacteria growing in their small intestines if that doesn't necessarily correlate with symptoms? Now, antibiotics can make people with irritable bowel-type symptoms diagnosed with SIBO feel better, so doesn't that prove SIBO was the cause? No, because it can make just as many people feel better who are negative for SIBO. Currently, rifaximin is most often used for SIBO, but it's not FDA approved for SIBO, so the cost can be prohibitive. In fact, no drug has been approved for SIBO, so even if you have good insurance, you may be shelling out of pocket as much as $50 a day, and you typically take it for 2 weeks. And while antibiotics may help in the short term, they may make things worse in the long term. Those who are given a course of antibiotics are more than 3 times as likely to report more bowel symptoms 4 months later than controls. So what can we do for these kind of symptoms? That's exactly what I'm going to turn to next. If you test more than 1,000 patients suffering from irritable bowel-type symptoms such as excess gas, bloating, diarrhea, and abdominal pain for longer than 6 months, who don't appear to have anything more serious going on, such as inflammatory bowel disease, a significant percentage were found to be suffering from lactose intolerance to the milk sugar lactose. In infancy, we have an enzyme in our small intestines that digests milk sugar, but most of us understandably lose it after weaning. Although a genetic mutation has led to the persistence of the enzyme in a minority of adults, about 75% of the world's population malabsorb lactose and have lactose intolerance after age 30. A third, though, were diagnosed with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. The evidence for SIBO and IBS symptoms is shrouded in controversy, predominantly because of the fact that the breath tests used in clinical practice to diagnose SIBO are not valid, as I explored in the last video. And it's not even clear what the implications are of having more versus less bacteria growing in your small intestine, since the number don't seem to correlate with symptoms. It turns out it's not the number, but the type. It's the kind of bugs you have growing in your small intestine. So it's small intestinal microbial dysbiosis, not overgrowth in general, but the wrong kind of growth that appears to underlie symptoms associated with functional gastrointestinal disorders like irritable bowel syndrome. How can you prevent this from happening? Well, the symptoms appear to be correlated to a significant drop in the number of Prevotella species. Remember them? Prevotella are healthy fiber feeders, suggestive of a higher fiber intake in healthy individuals, while the bugs found more in symptomatic patients ate sugar, which may reflect a higher dietary intake of sugars. Yes, but correlation doesn't mean causation. To prove cause and effect, you have to put it to the test, which is exactly what they did. Switching a group of healthy individuals who habitually ate a higher fiber diet to a more typical standard American low-fiber diet with lots of sugar produced striking results within just 7 days. First, 80% developed new gastrointestinal symptoms out of the blue, such as bloating and abdominal pain, that resolved on resumption of their more healthful, habitual, higher-fiber diet. And the diet-related changes in the small intestinal microbiome were predictive of symptoms and linked to an alteration in intestinal permeability. In other words, they developed a leaky gut within 7 days. And while some went from SIBO positive to SIBO negative, or SIBO negative to SIBO positive, it didn't matter, since the number of bacteria growing didn't correlate with symptoms. It was the type of bacteria growing. And no wonder their guts got leaky. Short-chain fatty acid levels plummeted. Those are the magical byproducts that our good gut bugs make from fiber, which play an important role in intestinal barrier integrity, meaning keeping our gut from getting leaky. So while we don't have sound data that something like a low FODMAP diet has any benefit for SIBO symptom patients, there have been more than a dozen randomized controlled trials putting fiber to the test, and overall, there was a significant improvement in symptoms among those randomized to increase their fiber intake. That may actually help explain why high-fiber plant-based diets may prevent so many common diseases, the effects such diets have on the composition and metabolic activity of our microbiome. Our good gut bugs take the plant residues like fiber and produce health-promoting and cancer-suppressing metabolites like those short-chain fatty acids, which have profound anti-inflammatory properties. All the evidence points to a physiological need for about 50 grams of fiber a day, which is the amount contained in the traditional African diet and associated with the prevention of westernized diseases. That's approximately twice what's typically recommended and 3 times more than what most people are getting day to day. Perhaps it should be no surprise we need so much. Even though we split from chimpanzees millions of years ago, there's still broad congruency in the composition of our respective microbiomes to this day. While they're still eating their 98 to 99% plant-based diets to feed their friendly flora with fiber, we've largely removed fiber-rich foods from our food supply. A poor diet now outranks smoking as the leading cause of death on the planet, as well as specifically in the United States. In the U.S., the #1 killer of Americans is the American diet. So if diet is humanity's #1 killer, then obviously it's the #1 thing taught in medical school, right? Sadly, medical students around the world are poorly trained in nutrition. It's not that medical students aren't interested in learning about it. Medical schools just aren't teaching it. Without a solid foundation of clinical nutrition knowledge and skills, physicians worldwide are generally not equipped to even begin to have an informed conversation about nutrition with their patients. How bad is it? One study assessing the clinical nutrition knowledge of medical doctors found the majority got 70% of the questions wrong, and they were multiple-choice questions, so they should have gotten about a fifth right just by chance. And the wrong answers were not limited to difficult or demanding questions. For example, less than half could guess how many calories are in fat, carbs, and protein. Only 1 in 10 knew the recommended protein intake, and only about 1 in 3 knew what a healthy BMI was. I mean, this is like super basic nutrition knowledge. And what's worse, not only did the majority of medical doctors get a failing grade, but 30% of those who failed had a high self-perception of their clinical nutrition expertise, meaning not only were they clueless about nutrition, they were also clueless that they were clueless about nutrition, a particularly bad combination, given that doctors are trusted and influential sources of healthy eating advice. For those majority of consumers who get information from their personal healthcare professional, 78% indicate making a change in their eating habits as a result of those conversations. So if everything the doctor knows they read in some checkout aisle magazine, that's what the patients are going to be following. Only a quarter of doctors surveyed correctly identified the American Heart Association's recommended number of fruit and vegetable servings per day, and fewer still were aware of the recommended daily added sugar limits. So how are they going to counsel patients on it? Yet again, of the doctors who perceive themselves as having high nutrition knowledge, 93% couldn't answer those two basic multiple-choice questions. Physicians with no genuine expertise in, say, brain surgery are neither likely to broadcast detailed opinions on that topic, nor have their quote-unquote expert opinions solicited by media. And most topical domains in medicine enjoy such respect. We defer expert opinion and commentary to actual experts. Not so with nutrition, where the common knowledge that physicians are generally ill-trained in this area is conjoined to routine invitations to physicians for their expert opinions on the matter. All too many are willing to provide their opinions absent any basis for actual expertise, or worse, made on the basis of bias and personal preference, sometimes directly tethered to personal gain, such as diet book sales. That's one of the reasons all the proceeds I receive from my books are donated directly to charity. I don't even want the appearance of any conflicts of interest. In a culture that routinely fails to distinguish expertise from mere opinion or personal anecdote, we physicians should be doing all we can to establish relevant barriers to entry for expert opinion on diet and nutrition, as in all other matters of genuine medical significance. I mean, we're not talking celebrity gossip. Lives are at stake, and there are entire industries devoted to marketing messages that may conspire directly against well-informed medical advice in this area. Medical education must be brought up to date. For physicians to be ill-trained in the very area most impactful on the rate of premature death at the population level is an absurd anachronism. The mission of medicine is to protect, defend, and advance the human condition. That mission cannot be fulfilled if diet is neglected. Maybe one place to start is for physicians and healthcare organizations to collectively begin to emphasize their seriousness about nutrition in healthcare by practicing what they at least should be preaching. Is it appropriate to serve pizza and soft drinks at a resident conference while bemoaning the high prevalence of obesity and encouraging patients to eat healthier? A similarly poor example exists in medical conferences, including national meetings where some morning sessions are accompanied by foods such as donuts and sausage. The muscle-related side effects from cholesterol-lowering statin drugs are often severe enough to make patients stop taking them. Of course, the side effects could be coincidental or psychosomatic and have nothing to do with the drug, given that many clinical trials show such side effects are rare. Of course, it's also possible that those clinical trials, funded by the drug companies themselves, underreported the side effects. The bottom line is that there's an urgent need to establish the true incidence of statin side effects. What proportion of symptomatic side effects in patients taking statins are genuinely caused by the drug? Even in big pharma-funded trials that found only a small minority of symptoms to be attributable to statins, researchers found that those taking statins were significantly more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than those randomized to placebo sugar pills. Why? We're still not exactly sure, but statins may have the double whammy effect of impairing insulin secretion from the pancreas, as well as diminishing insulin's effectiveness by increasing insulin resistance. Even short-term statin use may approximately double the odds of developing diabetes and diabetic complications. Here are the graphs. Those developing diabetes and diabetic complications off of statins over a period of about 5 years, and the development of diabetes on statins. And if that's not bad enough, this increased risk persists for years even after the statins were stopped. Now, in view of the overwhelming benefit of statins in the reduction of cardiovascular events, the #1 killer of men and women, any increase in risk of diabetes, only our 7th leading cause of death, would be outweighed by the cardiovascular benefits, right? That's a false dichotomy. We don't have to choose between heart disease and diabetes. We can treat the cause of both with the same diet and lifestyle changes. The diet that can not only stop but reverse heart disease is the same one that can also reverse type 2 diabetes. But what if, for whatever reason, you refuse to change your diet and lifestyle? In that case, what are the risks and benefits of starting statins? Don't expect to get the full scoop from your doctor, as most seemed clueless about the causal link with diabetes, so only a small fraction even bring it up with their patients. Overall, in patients for whom statin treatment is recommended by current guidelines, the benefits are said to greatly outweigh the risks, but that's for you to decide. Before we quantify exactly what the risks and benefits are, what exactly are the current guideline recommendations? How should you decide if a statin is right for you? If you have a history of heart disease or stroke, taking a statin medication is recommended, period, full stop, no discussion needed. If you do not yet have any known cardiovascular disease, then the decision should be based on calculating your own personal risk, which you can easily do online if you know your cholesterol and blood pressure numbers, with the American College of Cardiology Risk Estimator, the Framingham Risk Profiler, or the Reynolds Risk Score. Those are the direct links, but you can also use these shortened links. My favorite is the ACC one, since it not only gives your current 10-year risk, but also your lifetime risk. So for this person, for example, even though their risk of having a heart attack or stroke within the next decade is less than 10%, but if they don't clean up their act with those numbers, it's going to be nearly a flip of the coin. Whereas if you improved your cholesterol and blood pressure, you could drop that risk by more than tenfold. But the statin decision is based on your 10-year risk. So what do you do with that number? Well, under the current guidelines, if your 10-year risk is under 5%, then unless there are extenuating circumstances, you should just stick to diet, exercise, and smoking cessation to bring down your numbers. In contrast, if your 10-year risk hits 20%, then the recommendation is for you to add a statin drug on top of making lifestyle modifications. Under 7.5%, unless there are risk-enhancing factors, the tendency is to just stick with lifestyle changes, and over 7.5 to move towards adding drugs. Here's a list of risk-enhancing factors that your doctor should take into account when helping you make the decision: a bad family history, really high LDL, metabolic syndrome, chronic kidney or inflammatory conditions, persistently high triglycerides, or C-reactive protein, or Lp(a). If you're still not sure, these guidelines suggest you consider getting a coronary artery calcium score. But even though the radiation exposure from that test is relatively low these days, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has explicitly concluded that the current evidence is insufficient to conclude that the benefits outweigh the harms. Drug companies go out of their way, for example in direct-to-consumer ads, to present drugs as the preferred solution to cholesterol management, while downplaying lifestyle change. You see this echoed in the medical literature. Despite decades of exhortation for improvement, this editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association read, "The high prevalence of poor lifestyle behavior persists, with heart attacks and strokes remaining the leading causes of death in the United States. Clearly, we need to put more people on drugs." A reply was published in the British Medical Journal. Once again, doctors are implored to get real. Stop hoping that efforts to help their patients and communities adopt healthy lifestyle habits will succeed, and start prescribing more statins. Don't you see how this is a self-fulfilling prophecy? I should note that the author of the pro-statin editorial disclosed funding from 11 different drug companies, which make billions of dollars of cholesterol-lowering drugs. Every time the cholesterol guidelines expand the number of people eligible for statins, they're decried as a big kiss to Big Pharma. Understandably, since the majority of guideline panel members may have financial conflicts of interest. But these days, all the major statins are off-patent, so there are inexpensive generic versions. For example, the safest, most effective statin is generic Lipitor, sold as atorvastatin for as little as a few bucks a month. So these days, the cholesterol guidelines are not necessarily part of some industry plot. It's the American way of life that's the problem, not the guidelines. The reason so many people are candidates for cholesterol and blood pressure-lowering medications is because people are taking such terrible care of themselves. The bottom line is that individuals must take more responsibility for their own health behaviors. But if you're unwilling or unable to improve your diet and make lifestyle changes to bring down that risk, if your 10-year risk of having a heart attack is 7.5% or more, and gonna stay that way, then the benefits of taking a statin drug likely outweigh the risk, but that's really for you to decide. It's your body, your choice. Whether or not the overall balance of benefit and harm justifies the use of a medication for an individual patient cannot be determined by a guidelines committee, a healthcare system, or even your physician. Instead, it is the individual patient who has a fundamental right to decide whether or not taking a drug is worthwhile. This was recognized by some of medicine's luminaries, but only recently has the medical profession shifted from a paternalistic doctor-knows-best stance towards one explicitly endorsing patient-centered, evidence-based, shared decision-making. One of the problems with communicating statin evidence to support this shared decision-making is that most doctors have a poor understanding of concepts of risk, probability, statistics, but that understanding is critical for preventive medicine. When doctors offer a cholesterol-lowering drug, they're doing something quite different from treating a patient who is sick. They're almost like life insurance salespeople, peddling deferred benefits in exchange for an ongoing cost. In this new kind of medicine, not understanding risk is the equivalent of not knowing about basic anatomy. So let's dive in and see exactly what's at stake. When drug companies say a statin reduces the risk of a heart attack by 36%, that's what's called the relative risk. If you follow this asterisk here, you can see how they came up with that. In a large clinical study, 3% of patients not taking the statin drug had a heart attack within a certain amount of time, compared to 2% taking the drug. So the drug dropped heart attack risk from about 3% to 2%. That's about a one-third drop, hence the 36% reduced relative risk statistic. But another way to look at 3% to 2% is the absolute risk only dropped by 1%. So in effect, your chance of avoiding a heart attack over the next few years is about 97% without treatment, but you can increase it to about 98% by taking a statin every day. Another way to say that is that you'd have to treat 100 people with the drug to prevent a single heart attack. That statistic may shock a lot of people. If you ask patients what they were led to believe, they don't think the chance of avoiding a heart attack within a few years on statins is 1 in 100, but 1 in 2. on average, it was believed that most patients would be able to avert a heart attack, not just 1% of patients. And this disparity between the actual benefits and expected benefits could be viewed as a doctor's dilemma. On the one hand, it's not ethically acceptable for caregivers to deliberately mislead people into thinking a drug works better than it really does, but on the other hand, how else are we going to get people to take their pills? If you ask people, they want an absolute risk reduction of at least about 30% to take a cholesterol-lowering drug every day, whereas the actual absolute risk reduction is really only about 1%. So the dirty little secret is, if patients knew the truth, how little these drugs actually worked, almost no one would agree to take them. So either doctors are just not educating their patients, or they're actively misinforming them. Given that the majority of patients expect a much larger benefit than they'd actually be getting, there's a tension between the patient's right to know and the likely reduction in willingness to take the drugs if they discovered the truth. This sounds terribly paternalistic, but hundreds of thousands of lives may be at stake. If patients were fully informed, people would die. About 20 million Americans are on statins. Even if they saved 1 in 100, that could mean hundreds of thousands of lives lost if everyone stopped taking their statins. It's ironic that informing patients about statins would increase the very outcomes they were designed to prevent. Physicians have a duty to inform their patients about the risks and benefits of whatever they prescribe. However, physicians rarely communicate the absolute risk numbers, such as numbers needed to treat. In other words, how many people are actually helped by the drug, numbers needed to harm, in other words, how many people are actually hurt by the drug, or prolongation of life. How much longer will it enable you to live, despite patients wanting all this information? If doctors inform patients only about the relative risk reduction, for example, telling patients a pill will cut the risk of heart attacks by 34%, 9 out of 10 agree to take it. Give them the same information framed as absolute risk reduction, though 1.4% fewer patients had heart attacks, and those agreeing to take the drug drops to only 4 out of 10, and use the numbers needed to treat, and only 3 in 10 patients would agree to take it. So if you're a doctor, and you really want the patient to take the drug, which statistic are you going to use? The use of relative risk stats to inflate the benefits and absolute risk stats to downplay any side effects has been referred to as statistical deception. To see how one might spin a study to accomplish this, let's look at an example. Here's the incidence of heart attack over 5 years in those randomized to a placebo, compared to those getting the drug, a significantly lower risk. If you wanted statins to sound good, you'd use the relative risk reduction, a 24% lower risk. If you wanted statins to sound bad, you'd use the absolute risk reduction, just say 3% fewer heart attacks. Then you could flip it around for the side effects. For example, they found that 0.3%, 1 out of the 290 women in the placebo group got breast cancer over those 5 years, compared to 4.1%, 12 out of 286 in the statin group. So a pro-statin spin on this study would be like a 24% drop in heart attack risk and only 3.8% more breast cancers, whereas an anti-statin spin could be like only 3% fewer heart attacks compared to a 1,267% higher risk of breast cancer. Both portrayals are technically true, but you can see how easily you could manipulate people if you picked and chose how you were presenting the risks and benefits. So ideally, you'd use both the relative risk reduction and absolute risk reduction stats. In terms of benefits, when you compile a bunch of statin trials together, it looks like the relative risk reduction is 25%. So if your 10-year risk of a heart attack or stroke is 5%, then taking a statin would take that down from 5% to 3.75%, for an absolute risk reduction of 1.25%, or a number needed to treat of 80, meaning there's like a 1 in 80 chance that you'd avoid a heart attack or stroke taking the drug over the next 10 years. As you can see, as your baseline risk gets higher and higher, even though you have that same 25% risk reduction, your absolute risk reduction gets bigger and bigger. And by 20% baseline risk, you have a 1 in 20 chance of avoiding a heart attack or stroke over the subsequent decade if you take the drug. So those are the benefits. In terms of risk, that breast cancer finding appeared to be a fluke. Put all the studies together, and there was no association between use of statins and risk of cancer. In terms of muscle problems, estimates range from just 1 in 1,000 to closer to 1 in 50. If all those numbers are just blurring together, the Mayo Clinic developed a great visualization tool for those at average risk, considering a statin. Over the next 10 years, of 100 people doing nothing, 10 may have a heart attack. If all 100 took a statin every day for those 10 years, though, 8 would still have a heart attack, but 2 will have been spared. So there's like a 1 in 50 chance taking the drug would help you avert a heart attack over the next decade. What are the downsides? The cost and inconvenience of taking a pill every day, which can cause some gastrointestinal side effects, muscle aching and stiffness in maybe 5%, reversible liver inflammation in 2%, and more serious damage in perhaps 1 in 20,000 patients. Now note these 2 happy faces represent heart attacks averted, not lives saved. The chance a few years of statins will actually save your life if you have no known heart disease is about 1 in 250. If you want a more personalized approach, the Mayo Clinic has an interactive tool that also lets you calculate your 10-year risk. You can get there directly by going to bit.ly/statin decision. In response to the charge that describing the benefits of statin drugs only in terms of relative risk reduction is a statistical deception created to give the appearance that statins are more effective than they really are, it was pointed out that the problem with describing things in terms of absolute risk reduction, or number needed to treat, is that they can depend on the duration of the study. For example, say there's some disease that has a 2% chance of killing you every year, but there's some drug that cuts your risk 50%. That sounds amazing, but then you realize that at the end of the year your risk will only have fallen from 2% down to 1%. So the absolute reduction of your risk is only 1%. If 100 people were treated with the drug, instead of 2 people dying, 1 person would die. So you'd have to treat 100 people to save 1 life. So there's like a 99% chance that taking the drug all year will have no effect on you either way. So to say the drug cuts your risk of dying by 50% seems like you're overstating things. But think about it. The benefits accrue over time. If you have a 2% chance of dying every year, year after year, after a few decades, the majority of those who refused the drug would be dead, whereas the majority who took the drug would be alive. So yeah, maybe in the first year you took it, there was only like a 1% chance it would save your life, but eventually you could end up with a decent chance the drug would save your life after all. This is the very reason why using relative risk makes sense. Absolute risk changes depending on what time frame you're talking about, but with relative risk, you know that whatever risk you have, you can cut that risk in half taking the drug. Now, statins only cut your risk 25%, but since cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer of men and women, if you're unwilling to change your diet, that's a powerful argument in favor of these kinds of drugs. You can see the same kind of dependency on trial duration looking at the postponement of death by statin use. How much longer do you get to live if you take statins? The average postponement of death has some advantages over other statistics because it may offer a better intuitive understanding among the general public, whereas a stat like number needed to treat has more of a win-or-lose lottery-like quality. So when a statin drug prevents like 1 heart attack out of 100 people treated over 5 years, it's not like the other 99 completely lost out. Their cholesterol dropped too, and their heart disease progression also presumably slowed down, just not enough to catch a heart attack within that narrow time frame. So what's the effect of statins on average survival? According to an early estimate, if you put all the randomized trials together, the average postponement of death was calculated at maybe 3 or 4 days. What? I mean, who would take a drug every day for years just to live a few days longer? OK, well, first let's try to put that in context. 3 or 4 days is actually comparable to the gains in life expectancy from other medical interventions. For example, that's nearly identical to what you'd get from highly effective childhood vaccines. Because vaccines have been so effective in wiping out infectious diseases these days, they only add an average of about 3 extra days to a child's life. But of course, if your child is the rare life that gets saved, they gain an entire lifetime. That's why we vaccinate. It just seems like such a small average benefit because it gets distributed over the many millions of kids who get the vaccine. Is that the same with statins? An updated estimate was published in 2019, which explained that the prior estimate of 3 or 4 days was plagued by important weaknesses, and the actual average postponement of death was actually 10 whole days. Headline writers went giddy from these data, but they didn't understand is that this was only for the duration of the trial. So if your life expectancy is only 5 years, then yes, statins may only increase your lifespan by 10 days. But statins are meant to be taken a lot longer than that. What you want to know is how much longer you get to live if you stick with the drugs your whole life, and in that case, it's not living 10 extra days, but living up to 10 extra years. Taking statins can enable you to live years longer. That's because for every millimole per liter you drop your bad LDL cholesterol, you may live 3 years longer, maybe even 6 years longer, depending on which study you're reading. A millimole in US units is 39 points. Drop your LDL cholesterol about 39 points, and you could live years longer. Exercise your whole life, and you may only increase your lifespan by 6 months. Stopping smoking may net you 9 months, but drop your LDL cholesterol about 39 points, and you could live years longer. You can accomplish that by taking drugs, or achieve that within just 2 weeks of eating a diet packed with fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Want to know what's better than drugs? Something important and fundamental has been lost in the controversy about the broad expansion of statin therapy. It is imperative that patients be informed by their physicians, and hey, what about drug labels too, that not only their cholesterol levels, but also their cardiovascular risk can be reduced substantially by adoption of a plant-based dietary pattern, and without drugs. In fact, dietary modifications for cardiovascular risk reduction, including plant-based diets, have been shown to improve cholesterol status as well as obesity, hypertension, systemic inflammation, and on and on. The importance of this plant-based approach is magnified when one considers that, in contrast to statins, the side effects, weight loss, more energy, and improved quality of life, are beneficial.